Welcome. This week we're diving into one of the most important topics in our entire course, information literacy in higher education. Now, if you ask most people what academic librarians do, they might say organize books or help people find articles. But what we're going to explore this week is the teaching mission of academic librarianship, and I would argue this is where some of the most impactful work happens. Information literacy is not just a library buzzword, it's a core competency that determines whether students succeed or struggle in higher education. And with AI tools now generating content that looks polished but may be completely fabricated, this topic has never been more urgent. So let's get into it. Here's what we're covering this week. We're going to start by defining what information literacy actually means, and I promise you it's broader than you might think. Then we'll trace how the concept evolved over more than a century, from basic library instruction in the 1800s all the way to the ACRL framework that guides the profession today. We'll do a deep dive into all 6 frames of that framework, because you need to know these inside and out, not just for this course, but for your careers. Then we'll look at how librarians actually teach this stuff, what pedagogical approaches work, what models of integration exist, and how we assess whether students are actually learning. And we'll close with the big contemporary challenges, AI-generated content and misinformation. This is a packed week, but everything connects, and it all builds toward Assignment 4, your instruction design project. So pay close attention. So let's start with the fundamental question. What is information literacy? And I want you to really sit with this definition for a moment. Information literacy is the set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. That's from the ACRL, and every word in that definition matters. Notice it says reflective discovery, not just finding stuff, but thinking critically about what you're finding and why. It says how information is produced and valued, meaning you need to understand the systems behind the information, not just the information itself. And it says participating ethically, because how you use information has real consequences. Here's the thing I really want you to take away. Information literacy is not just can you use a database. That's a skill, and skills are part of it. But information literacy is much bigger than that. It's about understanding the entire information ecosystem. Can you recognize when you need information? Can you figure out the right tools and sources? Can you evaluate what you find for credibility and bias? Can you use it ethically? Can you understand the legal, economic, and social dimensions of information? These are the hallmarks of an information literate person, and developing these abilities in students is one of the central missions of academic libraries. Now, why does this matter so much in higher education specifically? Think about what we ask students to do in college. We ask them to conduct research, analyze sources, build evidence-based arguments, contribute to scholarly conversations. These are high-level intellectual tasks, and every single one of them depends on information literacy. Without these skills, students struggle, and I've seen this firsthand. They can't tell the difference between a peer-reviewed study and a blog post. They don't know how to evaluate whether a source is credible or biased. They don't understand citation practices, so they plagiarize without even realizing it. They type one phrase into Google, grab the first 3 results, and call it research. And now, and this is the new challenge, they ask ChatGPT to write a summary, and they take it at face value without verifying anything. And here's the critical point I want you to remember. Information literacy is not a one-time lesson. You don't teach it once in a first-year composition class and check the box. It's a developmental process. It deepens and becomes more sophisticated as students move through their academic careers. A first-year student learning to distinguish source types is doing information literacy. A doctoral student evaluating competing methodological frameworks is also doing information literacy. Same concept, different levels of complexity. All right, let's take a step back and look at where this whole idea of information literacy came from, because it didn't just appear overnight. We can trace the roots all the way back to 1876, when a librarian named Otis Robinson at the University of Rochester made this radical argument, radical for the time, that students shouldn't just come to the library and have librarians find things for them. They should learn to use library collections independently. That's 150 years ago, and we're still having versions of that same conversation today. Now, fast forward almost 100 years to 1974. Paul Zurkowski, who was the president of the Information Industry Association, writes a report for the U.S. National Commission on Libraries and Information Science, and in that report, he coins the term information literacy. This is the first time anyone uses that phrase in a formal document. Zurkowsky was worried that most Americans were not equipped to use the growing flood of information available to them. And again, this is 1974. Imagine what he'd say now. Then, in 1989, the American Library Association puts together a presidential committee on information literacy, and they publish a landmark report that basically says information literacy is essential to a free society, and it needs to be integrated into education at every level. This is the moment the profession really rallied around the concept. That momentum leads us to the year 2000, when ACRL, the Association of College and Research Libraries, publishes the Information Literacy Competency Standards, 5 standards, each with performance indicators and outcomes. This became the go-to framework for academic libraries across the country for over a decade. If you were an academic librarian in the 2000s, you were probably building your instruction program around these standards. But then something shifted. By 2016, ACRL replaced those standards with the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. And this was not just an update, it was a fundamentally different way of thinking about what information literacy is. We moved from a skills-based checklist model to a conceptual model built on what are called threshold concepts. We're going to dig into that shift next. So what actually changed between 2000 and 2016? This is important because it reflects a deeper shift in how we think about learning itself. The 2000 standards were very practical, very measurable. They asked questions like, can the student identify an information need? Can the student search a database effectively? Can the student cite sources correctly? And those are all useful things to assess. But the problem was, the standards treated information literacy like a checklist. You check these boxes and you're information literate. Done. The 2016 framework says, no, that's not how it works. Information literacy isn't a set of skills you acquire and then you're finished. It's a way of thinking. And the framework is built on this idea of threshold concepts. A threshold concept is an idea that, once you truly understand it, changes the way you see the world. You can't unlearn it. It transforms how you think about information permanently. Let me give you the key differences side by side. The standards were linear and prescriptive. Do this, then this, then this. The framework is flexible and interconnected. The concepts relate to each other and can be engaged in any order. The standards focused on skills. Can you do this task? The framework focuses on dispositions and knowledge practices. Do you think about information in a sophisticated way? The standards were designed for assessment checklists. The framework supports deeper contextual learning, and critically, the standards were one-size-fits-all, while the framework acknowledges that information literacy looks different in biology than it does in English or nursing or business. This was controversial, by the way. Some librarians loved the shift. Others felt like the framework was too abstract, too hard to assess. That debate is still ongoing in our profession, but the framework is what we work with now, so let's understand it deeply. The ACRL framework consists of 6 interconnected frames. Each one is anchored by a threshold concept, one of those transformative ideas we just talked about. And each frame includes 2 components: knowledge practices, which are the things learners actually do, and dispositions, which are the attitudes and habits of mind that learners develop over time. Here are the 6 frames. Authority is constructed and contextual. Information creation as a process, information has value, research as inquiry, scholarship as conversation, and searching as strategic exploration. Now, a couple of critical things to understand. First, these are not meant to be taught in order. They are not a sequence. They're interrelated and recursive, meaning students will circle back to these concepts again and again throughout their education, each time with deeper understanding. Second, no single instruction session can cover all 6. The idea is that across a student's entire academic experience, they encounter and develop all of these ways of thinking. Let's go through each one in depth. This is one of my favorite frames because it challenges something students often take for granted, that authority is fixed, that someone either is or isn't an expert, period. The threshold concept here is that authority is not absolute. It's constructed, built through credibility, expertise, and community recognition, and it's contextual. It depends on the situation you're in. Think about it this way. A medical doctor has tremendous authority when they're talking about a clinical treatment. But if that same doctor starts commenting on economic policy or immigration law, their authority doesn't automatically transfer. Their medical degree doesn't make them an expert on everything. Similarly, a peer-reviewed journal article carries authority in an academic context, but if you're working with an indigenous community, a community elder's oral testimony might carry more authority than any published paper. In terms of knowledge practices, learners who grasp this concept can define different types of authority: scholarly, professional, experiential, cultural. They evaluate sources based on context, Not just, is this a good source, but is this a good source for what I'm trying to do? And they recognize that authority structures can be exclusionary, that the systems we use to grant authority have historically kept certain voices out. The dispositions here are about developing informed skepticism, not cynicism, but a healthy habit of questioning, and being open to diverse voices and non-traditional sources of expertise. And here's a question I want you to think about for your discussion this week. How does AI-generated content challenge our understanding of authority? When ChatGPT gives you a beautifully written research summary, where does its authority come from? It has no credentials. It has no lived experience. It wasn't peer-reviewed. So what are we trusting when we trust AI output? That's a question our profession needs to grapple with. Here's another concept that seems obvious once you hear it, but changes how students think about research. Information doesn't just exist. It is created through a process, and that process shapes the final product. Think about the difference between a tweet, a peer-reviewed article, a documentary, and a raw data set. They might all relate to the same topic, but the process of creating each one, the decisions made, the audiences considered, the editorial gatekeeping involved, shapes what the final product looks like and what it can be used for. The knowledge practices here are about learners being able to articulate how the creation process affects the usefulness of information, recognizing that different formats serve different purposes, and assessing whether a particular information product is the right fit for a particular need. The dispositions are about valuing the process as much as the product, understanding that formats are not interchangeable, and accepting that the same information will look different across different formats, and each version has its own strengths and limitations. Let me give you an example that makes this concrete. A clinical drug trial produces raw data. That data gets analyzed and published as a peer-reviewed article. A journalist reads that article and writes a news story about it. Someone reads the news story and posts about it on social media. Each step in that chain is an information creation process. Each step adds interpretation and removes detail. By the time something hits social media, it might be 3 or 4 steps removed from the original data. Your students need to understand that chain and know how to trace information back to its source. This frame gets into territory that students often don't think about, the economics and politics of information. Information isn't just neutral data floating around. It has value, economic value, educational value, political value, and the value we assign to information shapes who gets access to it and who doesn't. The core concept here is that information possesses several dimensions of value. It can be a commodity, something bought and sold. It can be an educational resource. It can be a tool for influence and power. And the way we manage information value shows up in things like intellectual property law, copyright, open access publishing, and data privacy. Knowledge practices include understanding intellectual property, copyright, and fair use, concepts that many students have heard of but don't really understand. Recognizing the economic, social, and political interests that influence what information gets produced and who can access it, and making informed choices about how they share their own work and creative output. The dispositions are about respecting others' ideas through proper attribution, which goes beyond just avoiding plagiarism. It's about understanding why citation matters, examining your own information privilege, because not everyone has equal access to information. If you're at a well-funded research university with database subscriptions, you have access that someone at a small community college may not, and understanding the trade-offs between open access and proprietary publishing models. And here's a real current issue I want you to pay attention to. The rising cost of scholarly journal subscriptions has created a genuine crisis in academic libraries. The so-called serials crisis has been going on for decades, and it's getting worse. Many institutions simply cannot afford to provide access to all the research their communities need. Open access publishing has emerged as one response: make research freely available to everyone. But open access introduces its own challenges, like article processing charges that shift costs to authors and the explosion of predatory journals that will publish anything for a fee. This is a live issue you'll deal with as academic librarians. This frame is about changing how students think about what research actually is. Because most students come into college thinking research means find sources that support your thesis, put them in a paper, cite them, done. That's not research. That's what I call find and report. The threshold concept here is that research is an iterative process of asking increasingly complex questions whose answers generate additional questions or new lines of inquiry. Research is not about finding the answer. Singular, definitive. It's about exploring problems, testing ideas, and generating new understanding. The best research often ends with more questions than it started with. Knowledge practices include formulating questions based on gaps in existing knowledge, not just what do I want to write about, but what don't we know yet? Determining an appropriate scope, because a research question that's too broad is just as problematic as one that's too narrow. Using various research methods depending on what the inquiry requires, and organizing and synthesizing information from multiple sources, which is genuinely difficult and takes practice. The dispositions are about embracing research as open-ended exploration, valuing curiosity and persistence, and, this is key, recognizing that ambiguity and uncertainty are part of the process. Students often get frustrated when they can't find a clear, definitive answer. But in many fields, the interesting questions don't have clear answers. That's what makes them worth studying. Here's the teaching implication for those of you headed into academic librarianship. When we teach research as inquiry rather than as a find and report exercise, students develop deeper engagement with their topics and produce stronger work. Every reference interaction is an opportunity to model this. When a student comes to the desk and says, "I need 3 sources about climate change," you have a chance to help them develop a real research question, to move from topic to inquiry. That's some of the most impactful teaching you'll do. This is a beautiful metaphor, and once students get it, it changes everything about how they approach academic writing. The core concept is that scholarly work doesn't exist in isolation. It exists within an ongoing conversation among researchers, practitioners, and communities. Every article, every book, every conference presentation is a contribution to a conversation that has been going on for years, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries. No single work stands alone. Each one builds on, responds to, critiques, or extends what came before. And new contributions are valued precisely because they add something meaningful to this ongoing dialogue. The knowledge practices here include identifying what contribution a particular source makes to the larger conversation, not just what it says, but why it matters and what it's responding to. Recognizing that any given scholarly work may not represent the only or final perspective on a topic, and citing prior work not just to avoid plagiarism, but to acknowledge contributions and situate your own ideas within the conversation. The dispositions are about learners seeing themselves as contributors to scholarship, not just consumers of it. Understanding that conversations are ongoing and evolving, the literature on any topic is never done. And recognizing that entering a scholarly conversation requires familiarity with what's already been said. Here's how I explain this to students. A literature review is not just a list of what other people have said about your topic. That's a book report. A real literature review is your entry point into a scholarly conversation. You're synthesizing what's been said, analyzing the state of the field, identifying tensions and gaps, and positioning your own work within that dialogue. When you cite someone, you're not just giving credit. You're saying, "I'm aware of this conversation, and here's where I fit in." This last frame addresses something that might seem basic but is actually quite sophisticated. The threshold concept is that searching for information is not a simple linear activity. It's a complex, non-linear process that requires flexibility, creativity, and persistence. Effective searching involves selecting the right tools, refining your strategies, and knowing when to change course entirely. It's strategic, not mechanical. Knowledge practices include identifying and selecting appropriate search tools, databases, catalogs, search engines, archives, based on what you actually need. Constructing and refining search strategies using controlled vocabularies, Boolean operators, and other techniques. And understanding how information systems are organized, because the way a database structures information affects what you can find and how. Dispositions include understanding that your first search is almost never your best search. Realizing that different sources require different approaches. What works in Google does not work the same way in JSTOR or PubMed, and persisting through challenges rather than giving up when the first search doesn't produce good results. Here's the practical reality. Many students arrive at college believing that Google is sufficient for all of their research needs. And look, Google is an incredible tool, but it's not the right tool for every research task. Academic librarians help students understand why specialized databases exist, how controlled vocabularies work, which is a concept most students have never encountered, and why the search strategies that work in Google may actually fail in a discipline-specific database like ScienceinFo, ERIC, or PubMed. This is some of the most hands-on, immediately useful teaching that librarians do. Alright, now that we've covered what information literacy is, let's talk about how we teach it. Because knowing the content is only half the job, the other half is knowing how to help students learn it effectively. The research is clear on this. Lecturing at students about databases does not work. You cannot stand in front of a class for 50 minutes, click through screens, and expect students to retain meaningful skills. What works is active learning, getting students to engage directly with information, searching, evaluating, and discussing in real time. Hands-on keyboards, not passive note-taking. Scaffolded instruction is another key approach. This means introducing skills gradually and building on them over time. You wouldn't teach a first-year student the same way you teach a senior or a graduate student. A first year might be learning to distinguish scholarly from popular sources. An upper-level student should be critically evaluating competing scholarly arguments within their discipline. The instruction should match where the student is developmentally. Situated learning means embedding IL instruction into real coursework rather than teaching it in isolation. Students learn research skills best when they're working on an actual assignment with a real research question, not doing abstract exercises disconnected from their academic work. Backward design is an instructional planning approach borrowed from education theory. You start with the learning outcomes. What do you want students to be able to do at the end? And then you design activities and assessments that lead to those outcomes. This prevents the common mistake of planning a session by thinking, "What should I show them?" instead of asking, "What should they learn?" And finally, critical pedagogy. This is about helping students examine the power structures embedded in information systems. Who decides what gets published? Whose voices are marginalized? How do algorithms shape what information people can access? This approach pushes students beyond just using information to questioning the systems that produce and distribute it. So how do academic libraries actually deliver information literacy instruction? There are several models, and the one a library uses depends on institutional culture, resources, staffing, and the library's relationship with faculty. The most common model is the one-shot session. A librarian visits a class for a single session, usually 50 minutes, sometimes 75, typically tied to a specific assignment. This is the bread and butter of academic library instruction. It's widespread, it's manageable, and it reaches a lot of students. But it has real limitations. You can only cover so much in one session, there's little opportunity for follow-up, and students may not retain much if the session isn't closely tied to something they're working on. Embedded librarianship goes much deeper. In this model, a librarian is integrated into a course for the full semester. They might be present in the learning management system, participate in discussion boards, offer research consultations, and provide ongoing support throughout the research process. This allows for much richer engagement, but it's resource-intensive. A librarian can only be embedded in so many courses. Some institutions offer credit-bearing information literacy courses, standalone courses that students take for academic credit. These allow comprehensive, in-depth coverage. The downside is that students sometimes perceive them as separate from their real coursework, and not all institutions have the curricular space or political will to offer them. The gold standard, in my view, is the Curriculum Integrated Program. This is where IL learning outcomes are mapped across the entire curriculum, with progressive skill development from first year through graduation. It requires significant faculty collaboration and institutional buy-in, but when it works, it produces students who are genuinely sophisticated information users by the time they graduate. And then there are online guides and tutorials, LibGuides, video tutorials, interactive modules for self-paced learning. These are valuable supplements, but they rarely succeed as the only form of IL instruction. Students generally don't seek them out on their own unless they have a specific immediate need. Since the one-shot is what most of you will be doing early in your careers, let's talk about how to make it effective despite its constraints. Best practices start before you ever walk into the classroom. Collaborate with the course instructor ahead of time. Understand what assignments students are working on, what their learning goals are, and where they're struggling. This is not optional. It's essential. A generic library session is forgettable. A session tailored to the assignment students are actually working on is relevant and immediately applicable. Focus on 2 to 3 key concepts, not everything. The temptation is to show students every database, every feature, every trick. Resist that temptation. If you try to cover everything, students will remember nothing. Pick the 2 or 3 things that will help them most with their current assignment and teach those well. Use active learning. Get students searching, evaluating, and discussing. Think, pair, share works great. Give students a source, have them evaluate it with a partner, then discuss as a group. Live searching with student input works. Small group activities work. What doesn't work is 50 minutes of you clicking through database screens while students stare at their phones. Provide something students can reference later. A handout, a LibGuide, a one-page tip sheet. They won't remember everything from your session, but if they have a resource to go back to, your instruction extends beyond that single class period and end with a clear, specific takeaway, something students can apply immediately when they sit down to work on their assignment that evening. Now, common pitfalls: trying to cover too many databases, demonstrating without student interaction, teaching generic skills without connecting them to the course. And, this is a big one, not following up with the instructor afterward to assess whether the session had any impact. If you never ask, you never learn, and you never improve. Assessment is how we know whether our instruction is actually working, and it's how we demonstrate the library's educational value to our institutions. It matters a lot. Let's think about assessment at 3 levels. Formative assessment happens during instruction. These are quick, low-stakes activities that let you gauge student understanding in real time. Think pair-share, where students evaluate a source and explain their reasoning. Minute papers at the end of a session. Write down the most important thing you learned and one question you still have. Classroom polling, peer review of search strategies. These activities serve double duty. They're active learning and assessment at the same time. Summative assessment happens after instruction. Annotated bibliographies are fantastic for this because they require students to not just find sources, but evaluate and justify their selections. Research process reflections, where students document their search strategies and decision-making. These reveal so much about how students actually think about research. Rubrics that assess source quality in final papers, and pre-post tests that measure knowledge change before and after instruction. Then there's program-level assessment, which zooms out from individual sessions to look at the bigger picture. Mapping IL outcomes across the curriculum, analyzing trends in student research behavior over time, collaborating with institutional assessment offices to connect IL with broader learning outcomes and accreditation standards. This is strategic work, and it positions the library as a serious educational partner, not just a support service. Now let's talk about what's keeping a lot of us up at night. The rise of generative AI, ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot, and whatever comes next, has fundamentally challenged how we think about information literacy. And I don't say fundamentally lightly. Here's the problem. Students are now encountering information that is synthesized and generated by AI systems without clear authorship, without sourcing, and without editorial review. And it looks good. That's the dangerous part. AI-generated content can appear authoritative and well-structured even when it contains outright errors, fabricated citations. Yes, AI tools regularly make up citations that don't exist, or outdated information. Most students don't understand how large language models actually work. They don't know that these tools are predicting the next word in a sequence based on patterns in training data. They're not looking things up or researching. Students often treat AI output as if it came from a reliable reference source, and it absolutely is not that. Here's another challenge. Our traditional evaluation criteria don't map neatly onto AI-generated content. We teach students to check author credentials, publication source, and peer review status. But AI output has no author. It has no publication venue. It wasn't peer-reviewed. So how do you evaluate it? That's a new question our profession has to answer. And then there's the academic integrity dimension. The boundary between using AI as a tool and submitting AI-generated work as your own is genuinely unclear, and different instructors and institutions are drawing that line in different places. What does this mean for IL instruction? It means information literacy must now include AI literacy. Students need to understand how these tools work, what their limitations are, and when they are and aren't appropriate to use. They need to learn to verify AI-generated content against primary and secondary sources. Critical evaluation skills are more important than ever, not less. And we as librarians need to model responsible, transparent use of AI tools in our own work. Closely related to the AI challenge is the broader challenge of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Let me define these because the distinctions matter. Misinformation is false or inaccurate information spread without intent to deceive. Someone shares a health claim on Facebook that they genuinely believe is true but isn't. That's misinformation. Disinformation is false information deliberately created and spread to deceive. A state actor creates fake news articles to influence an election. That's disinformation. Malinformation is genuine, true information used out of context to mislead or cause harm. Someone takes a real statistic and frames it in a way that creates a false impression. That's malinformation. All three are problems and they require different responses. So what strategies do we teach? Lateral reading: instead of spending time evaluating a source in isolation, you immediately open new tabs and check what other sources say about the same claim. This is how professional fact-checkers work, and research shows it's far more effective than the traditional checklist approach to source evaluation. Source triangulation: verifying claims across multiple independent sources. Understanding algorithmic curation: helping students recognize how social media algorithms create filter bubbles and echo chambers that reinforce existing beliefs. And evaluating visual and multimedia content for manipulation, because images and videos can be altered, decontextualized, or generated by AI. Academic librarians are uniquely positioned to teach these skills. We combine expertise in source evaluation with a deep understanding of how information systems work. That combination is exactly what's needed in today's information environment. Here's something that's easy to overlook. Information literacy looks different depending on what discipline you're in. The ACRL framework is designed to be flexible enough to work across contexts, but effective IL instruction must be tailored to the disciplinary norms and practices of the students you're working with. In the sciences, the emphasis is on evaluating methodology, understanding peer review, and interpreting data. A biology student needs to be able to read a methods section and assess whether a study was well designed. In the humanities, the emphasis is on close reading, archival research, and understanding historiography, how the interpretation of a topic has changed over time. In the social sciences, research design, statistical literacy, and the ethical use of human subjects data are central concerns. And in professional programs, nursing, education, business, the emphasis tends to be on evidence-based practice, finding and applying research to real-world problems and decisions. This is where liaison librarianship becomes incredibly valuable. Academic librarians who serve as subject liaisons develop deep knowledge of their discipline's information landscape. They understand the key databases, the major journals, the publication norms, and the research methods, and they tailor their IL instruction accordingly. A one-shot session for a nursing class should look very different from a one-shot session for an American literature class, even if both sessions are about finding sources. The disciplinary context changes everything. Let me paint a picture of how many hats an academic librarian wears when it comes to information literacy, because it's not just teaching. You're a teacher, designing and delivering instruction sessions, workshops, and tutorials. Many academic librarians teach regularly, whether it's one-shot sessions, embedded courses, or even credit-bearing classes. You're a curriculum partner, collaborating with faculty to integrate IL outcomes into their course design and assignments. This role requires relationship building, strong communication skills, and an understanding of faculty culture. Faculty are busy, they have their own pressures, and they may not initially see the library as a teaching partner. Building that trust takes time and intentionality. You're a reference educator, because every reference interaction is a teaching opportunity. When you help a student refine a vague research question into something focused and manageable, or when you walk them through evaluating a source, you're doing IL instruction one-on-one. Some of the most impactful teaching happens at the reference desk, not in the classroom. You're a content creator, developing online guides, tutorials, videos, and learning objects that support IL learning beyond the walls of the library. You're an assessment specialist, designing assessments, collecting data on student learning, and using that evidence to improve your instruction and demonstrate the library's educational impact to administrators. And you're an advocate, championing information literacy at the institutional level. That means showing up to curriculum committee meetings, participating in accreditation processes, and inserting the library into strategic planning conversations. If the library isn't at the table when educational priorities are being set, someone else is making those decisions without you. Let me give you a scenario that pulls together everything we've been talking about. A mid-sized public university has been doing the same thing for years. One-shot library sessions for first-year English composition courses. Sound familiar? This is extremely common, but there are problems. Student feedback says the sessions feel disconnected from their coursework. Faculty in upper-level courses are reporting that students still can't evaluate sources effectively or construct decent research strategies. The one-shot model isn't failing because the librarians are bad teachers. It's failing because a single 50-minute session in a student's first semester cannot by itself produce sophisticated information literacy skills. The model has structural limitations, so the library decides to redesign. Here's what they did. First, they conducted a curriculum mapping exercise. They looked across the entire institution to identify where IL skills were being taught and where the gaps were. Second, they partnered with the English department to redesign the composition sequence with scaffolded IL outcomes built in. Third, they created an online pre-session module. Students complete it before the in-person session, which frees up class time for active learning instead of covering basics. Fourth, they developed a tiered program: foundational skills in Year 1, discipline-specific skills in Years 2 and 3, and advanced research methods in Year 4. And fifth, they implemented portfolio-based assessment, where students document their research development over time. The results? Faculty reported genuine improvement in student source selection and citation practices, and the library gained something arguably even more valuable: a stronger partnership with academic departments and a clearer, more visible role in the curriculum. That's the kind of institutional positioning that protects library programs when budget cuts come around. Let me bring it all together with the big ideas I want you to walk away with from this week. Information literacy is a foundational competency, not a nice-to-have, but essential for academic success and for functioning in a democratic society as a lifelong learner. The ACRL Framework shifted our profession from a skills-based checklist approach to a model built on threshold concepts, transformative ideas that permanently change how learners engage with information. The 6 frames: authority, information creation; value, research as inquiry; scholarship as conversation; and searching as strategic exploration, are interconnected and recursive. They're not a sequence you teach once. They're ways of thinking that students develop over time. Effective IL instruction uses active learning, is situated in disciplinary contexts, and is scaffolded across the curriculum. A single one-shot session can be valuable, but it's not sufficient on its own. AI and misinformation have made information literacy more important and more complex than it has ever been. This is not a crisis for our profession. It's an opportunity. The world needs what academic librarians know how to do. And finally, academic librarians are not support staff waiting for someone to ask for help. You are teachers, curriculum partners, and advocates for information literacy at your institutions. Own that identity. It matters.